Welcome to the Church Digital Podcast. My name is Jeff, and it is a pleasure to have you all join me today. We are on episode 18, and this is a phenomenal episode we've got set up for you. We're in the midst of a little micro series talking about micro locations and micro sites, and that's one of many puns that are coming in this interview. You've been warned. If you're not familiar with First Capital, it's a small church in a small town in Indiana who's had a huge success doing microsites and micro-locations using Church Online through their Church Anywhere program. Episode 17, we talked with some of their volunteers that are basically operating as the leaders, as the campus pastors at some of these locations, reaching as many from 30 to over 300 people a week doing ministry. And we just heard some awesome stories about how God is moving in a big way through some of these small locations. If you didn't listen to episode 17, you definitely want to take some time and go back and listen to it later. Today, episode 18, we're going to dive in with Randy Kirk, who's the lead pastor over at First Capital. And honestly, I was a little surprised by Randy a bit. He was on the older side. I mean, I'm not putting a number on that, but he was definitely more experienced in ministry and closer to retirement than not. But looking at him, it made me want to ask some questions like, how could someone at this stage of life be on board with such a non-conventional model of ministry, non-traditional model like microsites and micro-locations, even the Church Online and a lot of the things that their Church Anywhere program does? You typically don't see someone on board with somebody who's at that age and stage of life. So what was that like, Randy, as the lead pastor? How were you able to get on board? How are you able to turn the corner for this? The conversation, by the way, was incredible. Straight up, Randy's a humble guy, transparent. I can honestly tell you, I've never heard a pastor say the thing that came out of his mouth publicly like it did here on this broadcast. What specifically that was, you're just going to have to listen to hear that one in real time. So, audience, I give you Randy Armis, online pastor at Christ Fellowship Miami. I give you Tyler Sampson, engagement pastor over at First Capital, and Randy Kirk, lead pastor over at First Capital, in a conversation on Church Anywhere that I'm calling It's Not My Kingdom. Hey, everybody, here you go.
So Church Anywhere is a ministry philosophy that was birthed out of our online campus. We started streaming online about 3 years ago, and we noticed that we had some viewers, and so we decided to look into what it would look like to gather them in physical locations. And we started in a county jail, and from there it expanded to more prisons and jails, and then from there to elementary schools and the nursing homes and even neighborhood. And that's been our ministry shift over the last couple of years, and I think God has really done some amazing things through that. I'll tell you, since the last time we talked, that evening we had 2 jail services, and they had a spontaneous baptism at one of them, which was like the coolest thing ever. Yeah, so we just did that podcast, and like a couple hours later, my volunteer that leads that campus called me and was like floating out of the jail because he was so excited. So
that's cool, awesome. And what I love about this is the church is getting outside of its 4 walls. It's getting involved into the community. It's utilizing some of the content that the church is creating, and it's empowering volunteers to be the ministers, to be the pastors, to be the heroes of this story. And so I wanted to get a little bit into Randy Kirk. And by the way, if you want to hear some of those stories in the episode that Tyler was just talking about, it's episode 17. And so, check that out. It's the stories of Church Anywhere and those volunteers with it. But on that episode, I said I wanted to start off by asking Randy a question. And so, like, this is a loaded one. Randy, gear up for this. It's coming. So, Randy, and let me set the stage because I'm looking at Randy on video, but podcast listeners may not be. Randy, you're on the older side of life. And I don't want to offend because I don't want you coming after me, all the way from Indiana down to Miami. But he's closer to the retirement age than not with that. And so obviously some of the things that Tyler's doing and that Church Anywhere is doing is really stretching the norms of established church. Like, hey, we want to do church outside in 16 locations. Normally, like churches, this idea of in today 2019 churches come to this big building. It's more attractional. It's if you build it, they will come type of thing. Let's set up these church, or let's set up these micro or these multi-site locations around and get people to come to it. What you've done is you kind of turned it on its ear, and now you're pushing people out of your building into the community to do church where the community is. So when Tyler cast that vision to you for the first time, I got to know, like, what was your response? What was the first thing that went through your head when you heard about this?
First of all, I'm old, so I'm not held responsible for anything that happened 3 years ago.
Correct.
I'm not responsible for that. So, but no, when we first started talking about it, my initial reaction, and again, I had no context.
This was just online.
This was when we were talking about going online, and I told him I didn't want to give people an excuse to stay home in their pajamas and not come to church. And that's what I perceived it to be, was just a way that people would start not coming to the building and engaging in our worship experience. And we dialogued about it for several weeks, back and forth. And but I believe that Greg Rochelle says that we'll do anything short of sin to help people come to Jesus. And we believe that. And so we just said, let's give it a try and let's see what happens. And so we went online, and about 6 weeks into our online experience, we had people showing up, and we heard the same story over and over, and we still hear it today. And that is, we've been stalking you. That's their language, not ours.
Sure.
We've been stalking you. We've been watching you online. And now we have a sense and a feel for what we're going to experience when we get here.
That's good.
So we came in a lot more comfortable and confident about the experience because of our online experience.
Yeah, and with that, we are located in the actual worst location you could possibly be located for a church. We are in a neighborhood that's like, we're the only thing non-residential on our street, and it's a dead-end street on the wrong side of town. But there's no drive-by traffic. You can't even see us, and we're also connected to the high school parking lot. So like nobody knows where we're at, even in town, really. And so that the big thing for us online that we noticed was even people within our own city limits were like, man, I didn't know there was a church that did the things that we do in our own town. And so they started coming just because they didn't even know we were here before that.
That's powerful.
So now picture that. I don't know if you can even picture this, but we're on the back end of a dead end street on the wrong side of town in a small town. And you can't find us. When I first came here 16 years ago, my first slogan was, "You'd like us if you can find us."
It's defense.
That's good.
Because you can't find us, and people didn't know we existed. And again, our parking lot backs up to the high school, but it's a half a mile from the high school entrance to our parking lot because you've got to go all the way around to get there. And so we have this unique location that we've turned into a positive. And the only way people are going to find us is if we tell them and bring them with us. And so we've created a culture where it's bring with, not invite to.
That's good. You know,
That's good.
Those kinds of things they seem like small shifts in terms of language, but they're big shifts in terms of perspective. And I think it's great that you guys took those shifts. Both, first, I mean, you mentioned, Randy, that, hey, so we're going to open ourselves up to doing anything short of sin to reaching folks. And I've heard Craig say that too. A lot of folks, of course, get offended by that, in the wrong way. They're taking it in the wrong sense. They're focusing on the sin portion of that statement as opposed to the reaching folks portion of that statement. But the other thing of being willing to encourage folks to gather as opposed to just watch, that's huge. When did you guys make that shift to encouraging people to get together and actually watch the service? That's a big deal.
So that would have been about a year and a half ago. Actually, I brought that to you shortly after we started online.
Yes.
And it was a lot of conversation. 2 years ago, I put one microsite in the budget. I will never forget this. And that was literally the first thing that our elders cut from the budget for the year. So they always go through a final check and they're like, what can we cut to cut this down a little bit? Number one was microsites, because like nobody understood it at that point. Like, I mean, go back 2.5 years, like nobody's doing microsites. This is still a fresh thing. So it's not like there was a lot of churches we could model these after, or people would have heard of them or anything. So they cut that first thing. And so we really didn't get to try our first one until about 1.5 years ago.
Mm. Well, I'm going to throw a number at you. You've got 16 of these locations scattered around Corydon and surrounding areas, right? You got a prison ministry in a couple areas, but and just Tyler, to summarize, 4 or 5 prison ministries that are happening in area prisons, hospitals, schools, homes, rehab centers for Hodgkin's, which is by far my favorite story. Huntington's disease. That's by far my favorite story of all of them. Like what this does is it encourages people to get out of the building. Maybe the best place for them to be any given Sunday is not sitting in a pew watching your service in your building on the wrong side of town, but instead doing ministry out in the community and being the pastor, being the campus pastor, being the representative, being the person that God called them to be. Right now, and Tyler, you had this conversation. You guys have been on this road 2 or 3 years. Like churches struggle with that today. There are many conversations that I've had where pastors, Randy, they struggle. Like they're not ready to let people go out of the building. Did you struggle with that? Was your DNA already wired to go outside? Like I want to dig in a little bit to you here. How does it feel to shove people out the door?
Go for it.
Is that me?
That's you.
Yes, sir.
I thought that was you. Jeff, you need to know a little bit about who I am very, very quickly. And my background is I was a college basketball coach. And so for 20 years, I coached. And all I do today is I coach a church instead of coaching a basketball team. But everything I know about church, I learned in a gymnasium. And so with that, what you do, the first thing you do is you recruit people that have the potential to be All-Americans. If you don't recruit talent, you're never going to be good. And so we recruited talent. And Tyler is one of those All-Americans.
Yeah.
Yay, Tyler.
We could spend 10 minutes talking about the story of how I found Tyler and how he ended up here initially with us. That's a great story, but I'm going to skip past that. But what we've done is we put together a staff that then are All-Americans or potential All-Americans. And then how do you make those All-Americans into a team? Because a team is better than the sum of its parts. But a part of that is you trust them and you turn them loose. You don't buy a stallion. If you're in Kentucky, you don't buy a thoroughbred and put him in a stable and expect him to be what you want him to be. You've got to let him get out and run. And you got to let him run. Well, what we did is we recognized that in Tyler, we had an extremely gifted, an extremely good outside the box thinker. And we turned him loose. Now, that doesn't mean that that was carte blanche and that we never had conversations, because we had some really hard conversations. We still have hard conversations. But it is, don't recruit your staff unless you're going to turn them loose to do what you've recruited them to do.
That's good.
And so we have created this. Again, it's just good coaching.
Talk to me about this, because I understand, like the staff is one piece. One of the things that I see a lot of, or that I hear a lot of, and with pastors, is they have to be in the people, the audience. The church has to be together. The ecclesia, the church body, has to be in the worship center, worshiping together. And so that's where when I have these conversations about the micro locations and getting out there, like the pastor struggles with the theology of, no, we need to be gathering together. They need to be part of this larger thing, and not necessarily. I don't know if it's they don't trust the people to be the ministers. They don't feel like they've equipped them well enough. Like I don't know what honestly, I don't know what the struggle is. I'm just curious, like, were there struggles for you? Because you're a lead pastor. You've been doing this for a while coming into this. And so, like, did you struggle with this different way of thinking, or was it natural for you?
One of the things Tyler and I have in common is we're both outside the box thinkers. So that makes it easier for us. But one of the pieces that we have discovered, I'm going to walk you through another piece that leads to a philosophy. Back when I was a boy, that was before you all were even thought of, but back when I was a kid in the 50s and the 60s, the model was that you had a revival or a crusade, and people came to Jesus. And then out of that revival or crusade, they came to church, where they identified a cause or a place where they would plug in and serve in the church. And that's the way it was. It was this revival or crusade that led them to the church, that led them. Then along came this little church called Willow Creek. And in the late 80s, early 90s, everything shifted. And it became about the church. And you became this attractional model of church where you brought people to church because they liked where you were doing church. And that's where they met Christ. So before they had met Christ, then came to church. Now they've come to church and they meet Christ. And then they find a place to use their giftedness and plug in. But along about 2010, there was another shift that's taken place. And it took place outside the church rather than in the church. And that is, you've raised up a generation that are looking for a cause. They're looking for a cause, a place to plug in, a place to serve, a place to make a difference. And so we use cause in order to bring people to the church, to bring them to Christ. But sometimes in the cause, they come to Christ. That's what happened Tuesday night. We were out in the cause and people found Christ and they come to church. But it is understanding that our generation everybody's looking for a place where they can use their giftedness and their passion. And what we want to do is help people identify their passion and purpose and give them the opportunity to explore that and use that. And several years ago, we began tracking not baptisms. We've tracked baptisms all the way through. We started tracking baptizers. And
wow.
How many baptizers do we have? Because they are responsible not to bring them to the baptistry. Baptistry is just an entry point. Their job is to take them on and mentor them beyond that. And so we track baptizers. And, we'll have about 90% of our baptisms, about 90% of them will have a different baptizer. And which is pretty cool. And our staff barely is in the water anymore. I mean, we are. It's not like we aren't leading people to Christ too, but compared to most churches. Does that all make sense?
I'll add on to that. With that shift from if you build it, they will come, to let's find a cause and use that to bring people to the kingdom. Randy said it a couple of years ago, and it's stuck with me since then. We've spent like 15 to 20 years figuring out why in the world God would plant a church on the wrong side of town on a dead end street. And we realize it's because it doesn't matter where the church building is, because we are the church. And so like the walls don't necessarily matter as much as long as we're empowering people to go follow these passions and these causes. And that kind of gave us our answer. It was a strange way. So
one of the things that came up in the last episode 17, talking with your volunteers, was this was the passion that your church has to love on the community? Like I can remember Cindy Cindy, right? Yeah, Cindy going on and on about how that's just wired into who the church is. Did that happen overnight? Obviously it didn't happen overnight, but like, tell me about that genesis of how, a lot of time churches talk about loving the community, and loving the community means passing out a bottle of water or, doing yard work for a church or something like that, or for a school. Not to downplay those acts of service, but what you're doing is forming discipleship relationships with people in the community for the purpose of making disciples and leading them to Jesus. And that's a big shift that some churches struggle with today. How did that happen for First Capital?
I wish that we could take credit for that, but that predates our coming. The congregation was founded in November of 1990, and it's the first pastor was Drew Ashwell. And Drew was a really, really young guy, 22 years old when he started pastoring here in this new church. And Drew brought in this relational piece. I believe that any time that a guy is the lead guy for 5 years or more, he leaves a mark on the church's DNA, good or bad. He's going to leave a mark. The mark that Drew left was relationship, and this welcoming everybody. God loves everybody, and so do we, kind of a idea. He didn't market it that way. He didn't language it that way, but that was what was here. And so from the get-go, they had this, we had the advantage of being a church that already had that here. All we had to do was build on it. All we had to do is play to it, or just tell them sick them, because they were there. And so Drew left that with us. The guy that followed Drew taught him about worship. And that was the mark that he's left on our DNA. And then I'm the third pastor in the history of the church, and I've just got to build on what they've already done.
That's awesome. What are some ways, and we're talking about this, like, discipleship, rich relationship, empowering the attenders of your church, the people involved in your church, the volunteers, to be the hero of ministry, the baptizers, the spontaneous baptisms, the campus pastor of these micro locations. I'm just curious, what are some other ways, maybe less technological, more physical, where it's this discipleship rich volunteer is able to thrive and lead in your church? Like, how what does that look like in a physical sense, less virtual or digital?
In the last 6 years, our shepherds group, which is our elders, our leaders.
Your elders, and that's completely volunteer. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, it's
elderly. All of those are volunteer, but me.
Okay.
I'm the only one that's a shepherd that is on our staff, and I'm old enough to be one. But that room has turned over in the last 6 years. There's only one other than me that continue to serve in the room. So what they have done is they have raised up men to take their place. Jim Collins says that in Good to Great, that you get the right people on the bus and you get the right people in the right seat on the bus. But then he comes along about 8 years later and he says, but then you have to recognize, when I am the right person in the right seat on the bus, that I have to be ready to give up my seat, even though it's the right seat for me, for the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to be willing to give up my seat on the bus for the next guy. So we are right now, we're talking succession plan for me. And I have to be willing to give up the seat that I love and the seat that I could rightly call my seat, but it's not my seat. It's just the seat that I have been given the privilege to occupy. And it's not about me. And so I went to the leaders a couple of days ago, and we're talking about a succession plan, and we have some names in mind that could be viable. And I said, what if we hire 2 of those and I step aside? I just think it's appropriate that we consider that. If we get guys, if we find 2 All-Americans and they can take us places that we need to go, I don't need to get in the way.
Yeah. Just transparently, I can't believe you just said that on a podcast. I mean, like
that's not going out, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying listening audience all over 43 states, 20 countries. I don't know, but like, so this is amazing to me because of your humility and transparency in this. I don't see. Forgive me. I don't want to speak bad of the pastors I work with, but that right there, like that's not something that transparency, humility of, hey, you know what, Jim Collins, I may need to give up my seat. And by the way, if we can get better people to do this, let's look and have those conversations. Like that's healthy in the long stretch organizationally. But just out of respect for you, sir, like it takes a chunk out of you to be able to step aside and say, hey, God must be glorified. I'm not.
I got 2 pieces. The first is that it's not my kingdom, it's his kingdom. It's not my kingdom. It never has been. It's never been about me. And number 2 is we work with a homeless ministry that I can plug right into.
So job security's in place. It's probably a little less stress.
That's one of the Church Anywhere sites.
Church Anywhere sites is
So to go back to your initial question about how do we empower volunteers, I would say a vast majority of our staff would have a similar answer to Randy. Like I have a tattoo on my arm that says "Not the Kingdom of Tyler." It's a constant reminder, and we're intentional about bringing people on staff that I don't want to just talk the talk. I want to walk the walk as well. So I'm okay if I don't get the glory for ministry being done. If that means that someone like a Brad Reed from the last podcast gets to fulfill his potential. That dude was only baptized 2 years ago. Before that, he was living in an apartment that he couldn't even pay for the electricity because he was so on drugs and things like that. So in 2 years, God has taken him from that to leading a Church Anywhere site of 300 prisoners. And I'm okay with that if that means that he gets to further the kingdom. And I think that's really important to this whole thing is you have to have that sense of humility of it's not about you anymore. And people will follow that. We can empower people. If you live that life, they will want to follow and they will want to do it as well.
Yeah. So the picture you're painting is you're not recruiting these leaders. You're developing, you're discipling, you're growing them. You're not coming out and saying, hey, I need somebody to do this. They are growing up within your system and they're saying, I want to go here. I mean, is that kind of where it's at?
But here's another place, and that is the people that are most hungry to serve are those that have just come into the kingdom. The longer somebody's in and doesn't serve, the harder it is to move those people. Mm-hmm. And so many churches are just filled up with those people. And so the guys in our roles are trying to move people that aren't going to move. But it's if you can create the inertia where lost people are being found and they come in and they value what they have, and you start working with Brad immediately upon his accepting Jesus, and just say, you don't have to have experience and you don't have to know all the answers. You just have to know Jesus and be able to tell your story. And that's really all that we require. And so what we're trying to do is cultivate an environment where that happens. And then what happens is some of these old timers start watching these new people and they say, I want some of that. I like that. I want some of that. And the next thing you know, you've drugged one of those in that you would have had to have him kicking and screaming before. And now He gets it.
And one of the craziest parts of it is the thing that we hear the most is even with like baptizing someone, it's, well, I'm not qualified to do that. Or even praying out loud, I'm not qualified to do that. This kind of a model gives people no excuse. We just did a story on a guy named Nick that we put on Facebook that got to baptize his very first person ever at a Church Anywhere location. And so he told his story on a video, and he basically just said, I didn't feel qualified to baptize somebody, but he left different because of that. Because he stepped out of his comfort zone, because we gave him permission to do that. He left different, and now he was actually the guy that baptized the spontaneous baptism this Tuesday night. Yeah. So he went from not feeling qualified to do ministry to now have baptized 2 people in the last 4 weeks.
Wow. And it's that idea of decentralizing ministry, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but it's like, I love this idea of counting the baptizers, and we talked about this with oh man, I can't think of the guy's name. It was the online pastor, the online groups pastor from Saddleback.
Jay?
And so not Jay, it's the guy who works under Jay, Kevin Lee. Kevin, if you're listening, and I know you are, I'm sorry. It took me a while. But Kevin was talking about how they've got like pages of people that need to get baptized. And it's like, they're all over the country, and how you baptize these people, and so instead of them flying all over the country, to do these literally fly-by baptisms, let me fly into the city, take an Uber to where you are, dunk you, and then fly back home. They started training people, getting them spiritually capable to the place of where they could baptize someone. And that by doing that, it decentralizes, and it allows the people to grow spiritually deeper, because they're challenged to do things like pray publicly, share their faith, be able to stand up and speak towards spiritual things, complimenting something that's said from the stage. Like, that's phenomenal.
I'll say this. I would say about 15% or so of our volunteers are not from First Capital. So we have several other churches that we've, we don't want this to be an only First Capital thing. This is a kingdom thing, Church Anywhere. And so
let's park there, because that is another thing of this collaboration in context of church. It's not often found. How did that happen? Tell me that story.
Well, it goes back to this tattoo on my arm. For me, it's really not my kingdom. I have never sought to make the name First Capital famous, but to make the capital C Church, the kingdom, famous. And so I know that there's a thriving jail ministry, there's a community of people that like to do jail ministry. So why would we not tap into those people? We're already going in jails every single week, and these people love prisoners. So of course we want them to come along. We found out there's a homeless ministry, and they already provide a meal for people every Sunday. So why not do church and the meal? And so now, we don't send hardly any volunteers there. They have recruited all of their own volunteers to do church. We just provide the material, and so on. And if you can get past yourself a little bit, God makes some pretty amazing and big things happen, which has been really fun to watch.
That's right.
Wow. What have been the response from other churches when they're like, you want to do what? Or are they on board? Like the relationship that you have with the other churches, how is that fostered and grown?
Yeah,
both. Yeah, you have some that value it and appreciate it, and you have others.
They're like, what the heck are you talking about?
I lead another thing that's completely different from this. It's large churches in small towns. And so we meet together and talk about the unique challenges of being the large church in a small town. Mm-hmm. And with that, one of the things that you learn very rapidly is when your church becomes the large church in town, the other churches resent you. And there's a resentment that can build up because you are having success that they are not having. And so we face some of that, and that's just reality. You can't focus on that. And yet those that want to partner with us, then they're welcome. And those that want to learn from us, we want to share that. This isn't we're not looking at copywriting material and charging you to go there. It's not ours. It's God's.
Amen.
And all we want to do is, I'm going to stand before him someday, and I want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. That's all. Good and faithful. That's all. And it's not measured on how many we did or what numbers we did. It was, were you good and were you faithful? That's what I want to be. And that's what we want to be. And it's not rocket science. It's as long as you understand that it's his, then we do what we can with what we've got.
So with that, when somebody wants to give their life to Christ and be baptized on our online campus, we have absolutely no problem saying, man, that's awesome. Let's connect you with a local church where you're
That's
at.
right.
And we'll hand you over to a physical body of people. We have no problem with that whatsoever.
Where is this going? You're doing the micro locations.
We can tell you.
Randy, you just quit your job on air at the level, but so when churches talk micro locations, a lot of times, especially in the multi-site movement, multi-site churches, they're doing the micro locations for purpose of one day combining them into a campus to launch maybe a satellite multi-site campus, something like that. Are you guys what's the next step in this, or have you even gotten there yet?
I don't know the end. I really don't know the end, where this ends. I know the things we wrestle with. I know the challenges that we are concerned about. We are concerned about engagement. And we believe that, Carey Nieuwhof has said, internet's not going away. And so we know that that's where the world's going. And you can either set back and take shots at, well, these people aren't in a body and all that, and do nothing, and they're going to be on the internet anyway, whether you want to be or not. So we have to figure out what engagement looks like, and how do we enhance engagement. And so Tyler and Jared, another guy on our staff, have started a Rooted experience online.
Jeff was actually involved in this for a little while. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm excited. We're going to talk with Jared and Tyler, I think, in the next episode. Because I really want to dive into that. I'm actually trying to get somebody from Rooted to jump on the podcast with us to just even dive into what that online discipleship piece looks like. I didn't mean to trump where you're going, but
all I'm saying is we're trying to gather how do we create engagement.
Yeah.
And what does engagement look like? And what does community look like? How do you define community in our culture today? And we don't know the answers to all that, but we also know that we create a culture with what we present.
Yeah.
And leaders create culture.
You're talking to a lead pastor out there who's considering some of this, but may have some questions on where this is going. What's the finish line?
Yeah.
Talk to that lead pastor out there and explain to him your stance and your take on this.
Okay, I don't know, because I think the finish line's moving. I think it moves. But here's what I do know, and that is that there are people that are lost that don't even realize they're lost. And there are people missing out, and they don't even realize what they're missing out on. And there are people that are needy, and we have what they need. And I can't wait till I've got it all figured out before I go to those people. I go to them with what I've got, and I say, let's figure it out together. And the line's moving. And so we're already at places that I didn't see us going when Tyler came and said, let's do something, let's do our services online. We already have moved.
We're already moving. Like the micro sites
Yes.
are awesome, and we're going to continue expanding. But we're in talks of like what is next.
Beyond that.
Beyond that.
And it comes back to this cause piece, by the way.
And if we tell you more, we do have to kill you. So.
But
I'll stop the record and we can have that conversation. Gotcha.
Jeff, to answer it, and that is, all I know is if this is the tool that I have available to connect to people who need what we have found, then I use the tool. And that's what happened when we started with the organ in the 1500s. The organ was the tool that brought people to the assembly because that's the only place you could hear an organ. And take advantage of it. That's great. Well, we have a new tool, and we just want to use the tool. And how can we maximize that? And so we have a really creative team, but the one thing they have in common is they all love Jesus a whole lot. And they want people to have what they have found. So we're just going to turn this team loose, and I'm going to try to stay out of the way.
That was awesome. I literally don't even know what to. I will utilize church online is the new church organ analogy for years. That right. You know, Tyler's got his little tattoo there. I have a running joke on this podcast that whenever there's a mic drop, whenever there's a pull quote, like, is that tattoo worthy? And will I put Randy Kirk's name on my body? That right there may actually make the cut. My wife won't let it happen, and is listening to this. Don't worry, it's not ever going to happen. But my gosh, that was like, I may be tearing up here just thinking about that. This has been a great podcast. I want to thank you for this. I know lead pastors are busy, and just your transparency and openness in this conversation has been encouraging for me. It's been encouraging for the listeners out there. Ray was on with us, and I don't know if the listening audience noticed, he just disappeared. Where he was broadcasting from, lost internet, and so he was just out of luck. So he will listen in and sure enjoy this as much as I did. But as we're landing the plane here, wrapping up, Tyler, Randy, 20, 30 seconds. Any closing thoughts? Anything to add at this point?
I would just on the talking to lead pastors. You had asked me that question last podcast, and I didn't have a good answer. But yesterday we had a pretty real crisis in the morning with a person that watches us online, that's in an online small group that had sent a really serious emergency text to the church. And so for a lead pastor that thinks online viewers are not people, or not, like, they can't see them, so they're not actually there. We had to deal with a very real problem with a very real person yesterday that I only know because of the online campus. I've never met her, but I know her because I'm her pastor.
You're her pastor.
And so we were the first people that she came to, and because she came to us, we were able to get her the help that she needed in a crisis, a very real emergency.
She reached out to Tyler. She's with a life-threatening situation. Tyler, because of our microsites, reaches to the sheriff.
Like, I mean, on speed dial, like immediately. Yeah.
And he has access to the sheriff because of our relationship with the jail. The sheriff sends out.
He tracks her.
He tracks her, which we couldn't do, but he can because he's got the stuff to do that. He gets then EMTs to her in time to save her life.
All while Donnie, who's the other pastor on staff that helps a lot with Church Anywhere, the one I mentioned yesterday with the jails, or Tuesday, all while he's talking to her on the phone until the paramedics get there. So it was a team effort, but all because she is an online campus viewer.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
So if you're a senior pastor and you hear stories like that, I want them to know, like, these are real people that have real problems that they may have a legitimate reason not to come to church. They may not, but what does it matter if you're bringing them to the kingdom?
That's okay. So I've had a conversation with a pastor, not dropping names. He's not listening to this podcast, but at the end of the day, I've told him a story, not a life-threatening story, but a story like that. And that pastor would say, yeah, that person online is not my responsibility. And so, I mean, literally in this situation, it sounds like you've saved a life, and we're part of not a virtual salvation, but a physical, this person is still alive today. as a result of you guys being a church in a virtual space and connecting with people who aren't just sitting in a pew in your building.
Yeah, well,
And
I'll tell you this on that though. With this online small group that she's in, we have a couple from West Virginia who want to drive up to where she's at to visit her because they're in an online small group together. That's like a
awesome.
5-hour drive. So
Yeah.
like it's
And
crazy.
so like they want to visit, just the relationship is so tight through talking through, like you guys use what, Zoom for the online. So talking through a webcam using Zoom software, the relationship is so tight. These people are willing to drive 5 hours to come and check and to be with this person in her time of my gosh. Like if that's not the church, I don't know what is. So to you guys and what you've done with embracing this church online model, with running with it as a small church, you know, in 800s, sorry, I'm using numbers again. It's big church, small town. That majority of churches out there, there's 365,000 evangelical churches in America today. Maybe 10 to 15,000 are broadcasting any given Sunday. So your embracing of this technology is rare, especially with smaller sized churches. And you're seeing results from it, and you're using it for discipleship. You're growing your base, not just to consume content, but to actually live out the making disciple model that God's called us to. And so if I was wearing a hat, I'd say hats off. But I can tell you, I respect and I honor what you guys are doing and have done in the virtual space by making disciples who are making disciples. And so thank you for doing that and modeling what, honestly, what I would call a good, solid biblical model of what the church should be in 2019.
Jeff, your task now is to take what we've given you and make us look good.
Yes. It may take some editing. We'll see where we get to. But you don't need my help a lot for that. And I'm going to keep that in. I'm going to keep this in. You guys have done, I want to encourage you. You've done a phenomenal job. And the things that you're wrestling with, the way that you're marching forward with doing this, realizing, hey, God is going to say yes. It may not make sense, but God's being glorified through it. So why would I stop? God's bigger than my problems. Thank you. And my prayer, literally, my prayer is that people listening to this, that there are going to be church staff, there's going to be online pastors, there's going to be volunteers listening to this saying, my church needs to do this. And they're going to forward this podcast on to their lead pastor. And hopefully that lead pastor is encouraged to realize, hey, there are opportunities here to utilize technology, to get people out of the building, to get people into the community where they can love, disciple, and grow people closer to God, and that God can be glorified through the efforts of what's happening. Technology is not the abandonment of community. It's the birthing of new communities, which is what we're literally seeing through your Church Anywhere program. So if you can inspire one church through this, it's a win. And I'm telling you, many will be inspired by what's happened here. Anyway, and we're not even done. We're going to come back with Jared and some guys talking about your online discipleship, because I really want to talk about how that is fostered and grows, because that's a big deal in creating a disciple who's capable of training other disciples. And so I really want to explore that, which is what's coming up here in the next episode. Gentlemen, this has been phenomenal for Tyler, for Randy, for Ray, who was here for a little while and disappeared. My name is Jeff with the Church Digital Podcast. Looking forward to next time. See you then.